Professional, take 3.
Power couples. Michelle, Barack, Jay-Z and Beyonce, Bonnie and Clyde. That's who I thought we were.
God had commanded Adam even before I was created. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must never eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because if you do, and when you eat from it, you will certainly die.
What is it about boundaries that makes us want to test them, to push the limits, to see how far we can go without going too far? You ever had somebody push the boundaries of a conversation with you? Ask you questions you really don't want to answer or don't know how to answer?
Just because somebody asks you a question does not mean you have to answer it. I didn't have that wisdom beforehand to know that, and this is how I was set up.
The deceiver persuaded me that there was something more that I needed, that this tree of knowledge of good and evil would make us like gods.
For some people, intellectual stimulation and sparring is a conversational art form. It's fun to push the boundaries. For some people, it's about being right or having the last word. They engage.
The deceiver said, "Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" I should have walked away, but instead, I answered, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden." And I even added this, "You must not touch it, or you will die," which God had not said. Maybe by adding that one phrase, the deceiver knew that I was not solid in my understanding of what God had really commanded. God never said, "Do not touch it." Rather, he said, "Do not eat it." I had a partial truth and a partial understanding of what God had said and was talking to the master of lies and deception. He saw this as a crack in my foundation, an opportunity to twist things just a little, just enough to persuade me to shift my thinking, to entertain a seed of tainted truth that would quickly root in the soil of my doubt that what God had said would really happen.
But I've come to understand that not all conversations need to take place. Not all questions need to be answered. I took too much at face value.
I admit I messed up. I admit I was deceived. I admit I disobeyed God. I crossed the boundary. I made a really bad decision, and I had to face the consequences that came with it.
When we covet what others have, we can fall into wanting more, fall into wanting what is not within the boundaries of what God has given us. And as women, we can be covetous of so many things, of complexion, hair texture, body size, relationships. We often see beauty and abundance of blessings in others, but not ourselves. It's deception, because we have all been fearfully and wonderfully made. I was so abundantly blessed, and yet I wanted more. I wanted to be like a god. I wanted to be a god. I wanted what was never intended to be mine.
The deceiver said, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil."
I was engaging in a conversation strategically crafted to destroy my utopia, God's abundance in my life, and my communion with Him. My peace, joy, family, my marriage.
When the glory lifted and we saw things we had never seen in each other before, we saw ourselves naked. We were exposed. God had covered us, but now we covered ourselves in leaves. We tried to hide our shame from God. Shame for our nakedness. Shame for our decisions. Shame to know that we had failed God through our disobedience. When God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" I was not prepared for Adam's response. He said, "That woman, the one you gave me fruit and I ate it." He did not protect me. He did not use the words "we." The woman, that woman.
He chose just like me. He sinned just like me.
I was created for Adam. I was tailor-made. I was custom designed. I was created as a suitable helpmate. He blamed me. He also blamed God for giving me to him. What happened to bone of my bones? Flesh of my flesh?
When we are blessed with a little or a lot, two of the greatest dangers can be curiosity and greed. These culprits can cause one to feel that there's something better, that perhaps they are being overlooked, contained, or confined by boundaries. Is this the best, or is there something more? It always seems clearer in retrospect It always seems so obvious after the fact, after the poor choice, the betrayal, the sin.
But you listen to me. Be very careful to not let others put their baggage, mistakes, and poor decisions on you to take as your own. Stop owning what's not yours. So many people are looking for someone to blame. The things your family blames you for, the things your friend blames you for, the things you blame yourself for that don't belong to you, stop it. Give that blame back to its owner. You only have to accept what's rightfully yours. I own what's mine, and I will not carry around the shame that comes with my poor choices for the rest of my life. I may not confess them to you, but I'll confess them to God. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but those who renounce and confess them find mercy.
Welcome to Let's Talk About It. Keiko, Tamar, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
For having me.
Oh my goodness. So in the earlier episode, we were listening to different monologues from Eve and really just like experience her life from various vantage points. We heard about the topics about betrayal and boundaries and, blame and shame. And I just think it's so powerful because I think as women, we don't necessarily talk about that a lot and actually find ourselves moving through society a lot of times carrying these things without an outlet, and I'm curious how, has there ever been a moment in you all's life where you felt like you had boundaries crossed or, you made a poor choice and like people couldn't see past that and how did you handle it?
I feel like a lot of times sort of like the way that I grew up was not knowing the boundaries or no one told me what boundary is or was. And if you, maybe I have practiced it without knowing it.
Sure.
But more important ones that actually have more consequences, I feel like you need to actually like learn what it is, because not knowing it, where that boundary lies, can be very difficult and be like hurting to yourself and the people around you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. It makes me think about the line from the monologue where Eve is talking about, not every question deserves an answer. And I think sometimes when we are faced, it just makes me think about, like, for example, how like some guys test the boundaries. Like, it's just like, oh, you're so cute. And you're just like, thank you. That's clearly a compliment. And then it's just like, oh, you want to go out for dinner? Okay, sure. Like, so now it's like, okay, you didn't ask for lunch, we asked for dinner. And then I've even noticed some people very subtly will slide in like sexual connotations or sexual things. And I feel like that very much is also kind of testing the boundary, like, oh, is this person interested in that? Like, and I feel like if you're not attuned to it, or if no one has kind of put you on game of like, hey, if somebody's asking you this is what they're implying, then you don't know. And you're just like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. Or you answer the question like, yeah, I've had sex before, or what have you, not realizing that that's opening a door for a later conversation or a later, I'm gonna, maybe place my hand on your leg or something like that. You know what I'm saying? And so I definitely agree. If you don't have people in your life to kind of explain to you, hey, these are some boundaries, as you move through the world, you might want to be aware of, or just guidance, then oftentimes we don't know what those boundaries are until we're in those situations.
Right. And I feel like a lot of times when we learn is with the people who have those experiences that, the boundary being crossed, which is sad, right? Like, I don't know, like, I wish for the best world in which that like we don't have to care about these things.
Right.
But,
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
right?
Yes.
But sadly, that's the world we live in.
And I think that's why Eve's story is so important. Because if we can bring this to the world and to the community of women and others who are not necessarily women, young girls, especially because we're focusing on women, just to let them know, there are boundaries. And even though you said that, sometimes we don't know boundaries, sometimes we intrinsically know. This does not feel right. This does not sound right. But we as women sometimes feel like we can't speak. If I say that, is that going to make him not call me back? Or if I tell him, I'm not comfortable with you holding my hand, which, it's not a big deal, but I'm just not comfortable with that. And so we have these internal conflicts that we're constantly going through. I mean, if we had, little captions for everything that we're thinking sometimes, we'd be like, oh my goodness, well, just say it, just do it, just whatever. So I think that boundaries are extremely important, but it's also something that we need to get comfortable with speaking and articulating, and whether it's respected or not, stand firm.
Also, like, believing in what you're feeling. I think that's a lot of things that I have had trouble with, like, kind of growing up, is like, no one told me, or I didn't believe in myself that my feeling was right. Right? Like,
okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't validated, so you were uncertain. You were unsure.
And the society or whatever the message is telling me that, like, what you're feeling is not true, or like not right, or, is just you're confused, or just like, kind of like, nudge or sort of like directing me to be particular person, into particular thinking that just did not feel right. I think that, I don't know, happens to a lot of people that, I don't know, different culture, different people, but
yeah. I'm curious to hear your perspective as a parent, specifically, how did you go about imparting or sharing boundaries for your children, having once been a child yourself, and knowing the importance of boundaries from a protection standpoint?
When I was growing up, it was, I said so. And if my parents said so, there was no discussion. But a lot of times there wouldn't be the reasoning or the rationale behind the why you don't go past that. And so instead of me always interpreting that as protective, there were times when I felt it was just like almost punishment. Oh, you don't want me to be outside when, after a certain time. Why? What's the big deal? But it was protection. It was love. But sometimes it was conveyed as almost like a punishment. And so it didn't always sit well with me, but I did it out of fear, more so than out of, I know they love me and that's why. So, you know what I'm saying? Just in a general sense, not in every situation growing up. So when my children started coming on the scene, I tried to give them rationale. This is not a good idea because I don't want you to do this because. And, ultimately, you can't keep children from going beyond certain boundaries, because at some point, they're going to do what they're going to do. And I actually had a conversation with one of my children. I will never forget it. And they told me, they said, look, I'm the kind of child that if you tell me not to touch the stove because it's hot, I still have to touch the stove. And I appreciated the candidness of my child at that time, at his tender age, that the curiosity had to be satisfied in order for him to understand that what I said was true. And unfortunately for some people, even with boundaries that are set in love, with reasoning, there is still that, but I have to find out for myself. And even after that, even after the mistakes and the things that you knew were right, but they had to find out for themselves and go beyond the boundaries and push the boundaries, what you need to do as a parent is still say, hey, when you get through doing what you're doing, I'm still going to be here. Because God as Father did that for us. After you go out there and you make your mess ups, your poor decisions, I'm still going to be here. I'm still going to love you. I'm still going to forgive you. Just come home. Sort of like that prodigal son. So that's kind of my take on boundaries.
Speaking of boundaries and kind of shifting to that curiosity still being satisfied, how do you all navigate shame? I feel like more recently in popular culture, Brene Brown has become popular as far as talking about shame and vulnerability, and that shame is actually the culprit to us being authentic and vulnerable and like really growing and expanding and experiencing empathy with one another, and how oftentimes that is the impetus for us like seeking help or, you know, asking for what we need because we're afraid of judgment. We're afraid of all these different things. And I know in one of the monologues, you know, we were talking about the blame that kind of got put on Eve with getting them kicked out of the garden. And it's interesting because up until recently, I feel like I had never really heard anyone talk about her as just like she just made a mistake and that she wasn't alone in her mistake. But I feel like when we hear the story, it's always Eve is the reason they got kicked out. Eve is the reason we got child pains. Eve is the reason we got menstrual cramps. Eve, child. Eve, when I see her, I got some words, you know? And it's just like, yes, but also, you know, she was only on the scene, you know, a couple minutes. I mean, not literally, but you know, like, and at what point at what point does she receive grace? You know, and it's just like, at what point do we extend compassion? At what point do we extend forgiveness? Like, she made a mistake. And it's like, to think about her life and to think about some of the choices that I've made, it's like, man, that's a tall glass to try to drink if everybody is always like, oh, it's your fault. And no one is ever like, you made a mistake and look, we gonna move past it. And even just saying that makes me think about my grandmother, Auntie Tamara's mother, Ernestine D. Smith. She was a bad woman. And, you know, I remember my freshman year of college, I went on a women's retreat, and this woman was sharing how she was in a relationship with an African-American man, and she was of Southeast Asian Indian descent. And she was sharing how she knew that she could never bring him home to her parents. And that the love that she received from her parents in regards to that relationship was conditional. And I had never heard anyone kind of like put love and conditions kind of in that same language. You always hear people talk about love unconditionally, but I had never really heard it like that. And I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever experienced love like that. Like, I've always experienced unconditional love. And specifically when I think about unconditional love, I think about my grandma. And, you know, just kind of looping it back around, what must it be like to have to be in relationships or deal with people when you feel like their engagement with you or their love to you or whatever is based on conditions, and you can't afford to mess up?
I'm sure you might want to speak to it, but I'm going to just say this before you do. That doesn't sound like love to me. That's not how I define love. If my love is only based on certain conditions, and if I don't meet those conditions, then you can't have my love. You're not worthy of my love. I have to earn your love. I gotta check every box in order for you to love me and accept me or my decisions. I mean that's real. That's real in our world. We're dealing with it. I mean, and I'm not above and beyond it. But that's not love. And like you said, that's not unconditional love. It may be limited love. So go ahead, Keiko.
Yeah, it does sound like transaction, right? That, or it's like a bartering, or right, like it's current. It's almost sounds like currency to me. But I do feel like, especially like where I grew up, the concept of love isn't the way that it is here. So
will you tell the people where you grew up?
Japan.
Okay. Where in Japan?
In Tokyo.
Very good. Okay.
But you know, growing up in Tokyo is like a weird experience because, you know, Tokyo, it has much more in common with like New York than countryside of Japan. So it's like it's just that particular experience. But that aside, and also it's very, you know, like America, you know, very like, you know, mass media influenced and a lot of messages. But like, I think the example that you shared is also political, right? And in that kind of way, I think we're in whatever particular political situation, that until we realize it, we don't know that we're in it, right? And then we think, you know, like when, you know, I brought my now husband to first to my parents, you know, it could upset their worldview, right? Because if he's not in the particular checkbox, and I'm sure I know for a fact that they actually did look him up, and then that all he actually checked all of the check boxes, or most of them.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
I don't know if he, my parents were expecting someone who was not Japanese, but I don't know. I can never tell because my parents also have lived here for a while, so they know.
They've lived here in the States.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I don't know what their expectations are. We also may be pretty young too, but yeah, I don't know. Like a lot of times, I feel like we don't realize that the conditions actually do exist, and I think the challenge is when we realize that conditions exist, can we let go of it, or like how do we deal with the conditions? That may be where that truer love can manifest. It sounds like a test, right? Like when it manifests.
Yeah.
Because it's not something like I have all these rules, right? And then before everything is, you have to pass all this. Like you didn't know that you had those rules a lot of times.
Right. You don't know sometimes.
Yeah. And it makes me think about, I think a phrase that I heard is just like, love isn't, the passion and the butterflies and, the hearts and rainbows. It's a choice.
Right.
And like waking up daily and choosing that person. Because as we all know, looks fade, the money comes and goes, the children come and go. Your husband and wife may come and go, but it's just like, am I going to wake up and choose to love this person? Awesome. Well, Tamar and Keiko, thank you so much for joining us today for this after show